Good evening. Welcome to Whispered History. Tonight we are going to travel deep into the history of the American Southwest and the Southern Plains, to a world of enormous grasslands, desert mountains, winding rivers, buffalo herds, Spanish settlements, frontier towns, and indigenous nations whose histories stretched back long before the United States existed. This is the story of two powerful peoples, the Comanche and the Apache. Their history is sometimes reduced to a simple story of enemies fighting over the Southwest. But the real story is far more complicated. It is a story of migration, of survival, of trade and warfare, of shifting alliances, of horses and buffalo, and of two peoples trying to protect their families and homelands while an entirely new world was slowly moving toward them. So tonight, make yourself comfortable. Let the noise of the modern world fade away. And imagine a time when the horizon seemed almost endless, when the sound of hoofbeats could travel across the grasslands, and when the fate of entire communities could change with the movement of a single hunting party. Before we begin, if you enjoy these long, relaxing journeys through history, please take a moment to like this video. Leave a comment telling me where you're listening from, and subscribe to Whispered History. Your support helps us continue creating these long-form historical stories for sleep. Now, let us begin. Long before American highways crossed the Southwest, long before railroads connected distant cities, and long before maps divided the region into states and territories, the Southwest was already home to a remarkable collection of indigenous nations. The landscape itself was enormous. To the west were deserts and rugged mountains. To the east stretched the Great Plains. Between them were rivers, mesas, forests, grasslands, and countless smaller environments. Rainfall could be unpredictable, winters could be severe, summer heat could be overwhelming. Yet people had learned how to live here for thousands of years. Among those peoples were the Apache. But it is important to understand that the word Apache describes several distinct peoples and communities rather than one single unified nation. Different Apache groups lived across broad portions of the Southwest and Southern Great Plains. Among them were the Western Apache, Chiricahua, Mescalero, Jicarilla, Lipan, and others. They spoke related Athabascan languages. Their communities had their own leaders, traditions, territories, and histories. They were hunters, gatherers, farmers, traders, and warriors. Their way of life depended upon the environment around them. Some Apache communities cultivated crops. Others relied heavily on hunting and gathering. Many adapted their activities according to the seasons. They knew where water could be found. They understood the behavior of animals. They knew which plants could provide food or medicine, and they knew how to move through difficult terrain. Their knowledge of the Southwest was deep. Then, far to the north, another people were undergoing a transformation that would eventually change the balance of power across the plains, the Comanche. The Comanche were part of the larger Uto-Aztecan language family. Their ancestors were associated with the Eastern Shoshone and the broader Great Basin world. Over time, some groups began moving eastward from the Rocky Mountain region, and then came one of the most important developments in their history, the horse. Horses had been introduced into North America by the Spanish. They escaped, multiplied, and spread across indigenous trading networks. By the late 17th and early 18th centuries, horses were transforming life across the plains. For the Comanche, this transformation would become especially important. They became extraordinarily skilled horsemen. Mobility changed everything. A hunter could travel farther. A family could move more easily. A warrior could strike quickly and withdraw. A larger territory could be crossed in a fraction of the time it once required. The horse did not create Comanche power by itself. The Comanche already possessed knowledge, organization, courage, and adaptability. But the horse gave them a new advantage, and they used it brilliantly. As Comanche groups moved onto the southern plains, they encountered other indigenous peoples. Some became trading partners, some became rivals, and some became enemies. Among the peoples they encountered were Apache groups who had already occupied portions of the southern plains and southwest. The meeting between the Comanche and Apache would become one of the most consequential relationships in the history of the region. It would involve warfare, but it would also involve trade, and that distinction matters. The two peoples did not spend every moment fighting. They interacted within a larger world of commerce, diplomacy, migration, and competition. A horse could be traded. A buffalo robe could be exchanged. Captives could sometimes become part of another community. Information could move between groups, and alliances could change. The plains were not divided into permanent camps of friends and enemies. Relationships were fluid, yet competition for resources could become intense. The buffalo was at the center of plains life. Buffalo provided meat. Their hides could become clothing, shelter, containers, and other useful objects. Their bones could be turned into tools. The animals were not simply an economic resource, they were part of a larger cultural and spiritual world. Whoever controlled access to major buffalo grounds possessed enormous advantages, and the Comanche were moving into some of the richest hunting territories on the continent. Their expansion placed pressure on peoples already living there. The Apache were among them. For the Apache, the arrival of increasingly powerful Comanche groups was a serious challenge. The Comanche were mobile. They could travel enormous distances. They could raid livestock. They could attack settlements. They could compete for hunting grounds. And their growing horse herds gave them an expanding economic base. The balance of power was beginning to shift. But there was another force entering this complicated world: the Spanish. Spanish settlements had existed in the Southwest for generations. Missionaries and soldiers had established communities in New Mexico and elsewhere. The Spanish were attempting to control indigenous populations, expand Christianity, and maintain their colonial frontier. They soon realized that the Comanche were becoming an important military power. The Apache were also dealing with Spanish pressure. So now, the Southwest was becoming a place where several competing powers were interacting: Apache communities, Comanche bands, Pueblo peoples, Spanish settlers, and other indigenous nations. Each had different interests, each had its own understanding of the land, and each was trying to survive in a rapidly changing world. For the Comanche, the southern plains offered opportunity. For the Apache, it increasingly became a place where they had to defend themselves against a powerful new rival. The conflict would not happen overnight. It would develop over generations. There would be battles, there would be raids, there would be negotiations, there would be temporary peace, and there would be periods when one side appeared to have the advantage, only for the balance to shift again. Eventually, the Comanche would become one of the dominant powers of the southern plains. Their influence would extend across enormous distances. The region they controlled would later become known as part of the Comanchería. But before that empire-like sphere of influence emerged, the foundations had to be laid. And those foundations were being built in the grasslands, through horses, through buffalo, through trade, and through the extraordinary ability to move. Meanwhile, Apache communities were adapting as well. They would retreat into mountains and deserts when necessary. They would develop their own strategies. They would form alliances. They would resist, and they would continue to survive. Neither people could yet know how dramatically the coming centuries would change their world. They could not know that Spanish power would eventually weaken. They could not know that Mexico would gain independence. They could not know that the United States would eventually claim much of the Southwest. And they certainly could not know that railroads, firearms, settlers, and federal armies would one day transform the entire region. For now, the grasslands remained vast. The buffalo herds stretched toward the horizon. The mountains stood beyond the plains, and riders moved beneath an enormous sky. The struggle for the Southwest was beginning to take shape, not as a single war, but as a long series of migrations, encounters, conflicts, alliances, and adaptations. And at the center of this changing world stood two powerful peoples, the Comanche and the Apache. Their story was about to become one of the most remarkable chapters in the history of the American West. The story of the Comanche and Apache cannot be understood without first understanding the world they inhabited. The southern plains were enormous, from the foothills of the Rocky Mountains to the grasslands of Texas, and from the dry country of New Mexico toward the great river systems of the Central Plains. There was a landscape that seemed almost without end, but it was not empty. It was filled with life. Buffalo moved across the grasslands in enormous herds. Deer lived near wooded river valleys. Antelope crossed the open plains, rivers provided water, and scattered forests offered shelter from the heat and cold. For indigenous peoples, this landscape was not simply wilderness, it was home. Every river had meaning. Every mountain could have a story. Every trail was connected to generations of movement, and every hunting ground could determine whether a community would prosper or struggle. The Apache had already developed ways of surviving in this difficult environment. Different Apache peoples lived across different regions, and their lifestyles varied. Some communities farmed, others depended heavily on hunting and gathering. Some lived in desert environments. Others occupied mountains and plains. Their flexibility was one of their greatest strengths. They could move when conditions changed. They could take advantage of seasonal resources. And they could use difficult terrain to their advantage. But the arrival of the Comanche was changing the balance. The Comanche were becoming increasingly connected to the horse, and the horse transformed their world. Imagine a hunter who once had to travel on foot. Now he could ride. He could cover miles in a day. He could follow buffalo herds farther. He could carry more supplies. He could move an entire camp with greater speed. The horse made distance less important, and across the plains, distance had always been one of the greatest barriers. The Comanche learned quickly. They became exceptional horsemen. Their relationship with horses became central to their economy and military power. Horses could be traded, they could be captured, they could be exchanged with other indigenous peoples, they could be used for hunting, and they could support long-distance travel. The Comanche were not simply becoming better riders, they were developing a new way of life around mobility. As their numbers and herds grew, Comanche groups moved farther south and east. They entered regions where Apache communities had already established themselves. At first, the relationship was not necessarily one of constant warfare. Trade was possible. Information was exchanged. People interacted. But competition grew. The buffalo grounds were valuable. Water sources were valuable. Horses were valuable. And control over territory could provide enormous advantages. The Comanche began establishing influence across the southern plains. This expanding region would eventually become known as the Comanchería. It was not an empire with fixed borders in the European sense. There were no walls around it. There was no single capital city. Instead, it was a vast sphere of influence. Comanche bands moved through it. They hunted there, they traded there, they raided there, they negotiated there, and they defended their access to it. The size of the Comanchería was extraordinary. At its height, Comanche influence extended across portions of present-day Texas, New Mexico, Oklahoma, Kansas, Colorado, and surrounding regions. This mobility gave the Comanche enormous power, but it also created conflict. Apache groups that had previously controlled portions of the southern plains now faced increasing pressure. The Apache had horses too. They adapted to mounted warfare, but the Comanche became especially dominant in the use of the horse. Their speed allowed them to strike quickly. A mounted group could appear unexpectedly. It could attack, and it could disappear across the plains before an enemy could organize a response. This made them difficult to defeat. The Apache responded in their own ways. Some moved toward more defensible areas. Mountains and rugged terrain could reduce the advantage of Comanche cavalry. Some communities strengthened alliances, others continued fighting, and some engaged in trade when it was useful. The struggle, therefore, became a complicated mixture of warfare and diplomacy. One year could bring conflict. The next could bring negotiation. A temporary peace might allow trade to resume. Then another dispute could reopen the fighting. This was common across the frontier. There were no permanent categories of friend and enemy. Survival required flexibility, and the Apache had plenty of experience with adaptation. But the Comanche were becoming one of the dominant powers of the southern plains. Their influence also affected the Spanish. Spanish officials in New Mexico began to recognize that the Comanche could not easily be controlled through military force alone. The Spanish had soldiers, they had firearms, they had fortified settlements, but the Comanche possessed something extremely valuable: mobility. A Spanish soldier could defend a settlement. A mounted Comanche group could move hundreds of miles across open country. The Spanish, therefore, began experimenting with diplomacy. Trade became an important tool. Officials sometimes sought peace with Comanche leaders. They hoped that agreements would reduce raids and stabilize the frontier. But peace was complicated. Different Comanche bands had their own leaders. A treaty with one group did not necessarily mean every Comanche would accept it. The same was true among the Apache. There was no single Apache government that could speak for every Apache community. The Southwest was a world of decentralized power. This made diplomacy difficult for European governments. They preferred dealing with a single authority, but indigenous political systems often worked differently. Leadership could be local, authority could depend on reputation, and decisions could be negotiated among families and communities. The Spanish slowly learned this reality, yet the pressure on the Apache continued. Comanche expansion disrupted established patterns of movement. Apache hunting territories were affected. Trade routes changed. And some Apache communities were pushed farther south or west. The Comanche were not simply expanding into empty land. They were entering a region already occupied by other peoples. And this is where the story becomes especially important. The struggle was not simply about two nations fighting. It was about a changing balance of power across the entire Southwest. The arrival of the horse had transformed indigenous societies. The growth of the buffalo economy had created enormous wealth. European colonies had introduced new markets and new weapons. And indigenous nations were adapting to all of these changes. The Comanche became masters of the plains, but their rise also created new enemies. The Apache were determined to survive. The Spanish wanted to protect their settlements. Pueblo communities were navigating their own interests, and other plains nations were watching the Comanche rise. Meanwhile, farther north and east, another world was developing. French and British traders were expanding their own networks. European goods were entering indigenous economies. Firearms, metal tools, cloth, and other manufactured goods could now travel across enormous distances. The plains were becoming increasingly connected to the global economy, and the Comanche were positioned perfectly to take advantage of it. They had horses, they had buffalo, they had mobility, and they controlled important routes. Trade could make them wealthy. Raiding could provide additional horses and livestock, and military power could protect their interests. The Apache faced the same changing economy, but from a more difficult position. Their territories were being pressured from multiple directions. The Comanche were expanding. Spanish settlements were growing. Other indigenous peoples were competing for resources, and the landscape itself could be unforgiving. Still, the Apache endured. They were experienced fighters. They understood the terrain, and they were capable of adapting their strategies. The conflict between the Comanche and Apache would therefore continue for generations. It would never be a single, continuous war. Instead, it would rise and fall. There would be periods of intense fighting. There would be periods of relative peace. There would be trade. There would be intermarriage. There would be captives absorbed into communities. There would be alliances against common enemies. And there would be betrayals and revenge. The Southwest was becoming a world where relationships could change quickly. The Comanche were rising, the Apache were resisting, and the Spanish were realizing that neither people could simply be forced into submission. But the greatest transformation was still ahead. The Spanish colonial system would eventually weaken. Mexico would become independent. American settlers would move west, and the United States would bring an entirely new military and economic power into the region. For now, however, the southern plains still belonged to the buffalo. The grasslands stretched beneath the open sky. Comanche riders moved across the horizon. Apache communities watched the changing world around them, and somewhere beyond the distant mountains, the future was already approaching. The balance of power on the southern plains was changing. The Comanche were becoming increasingly powerful. Their horses gave them extraordinary mobility. The buffalo provided food, clothing, tools, and wealth, and their knowledge of the plains allowed them to travel across enormous distances. But the Apache were not simply disappearing. They were adapting. They were moving. They were fighting, and they were searching for ways to protect their communities in a world that was becoming increasingly dangerous. The struggle between the two peoples was entering a new phase. For generations, Apache communities had occupied large areas of the southern plains and southwest, but Comanche expansion placed increasing pressure on them. Some Apache groups moved toward the mountains. Others shifted their hunting grounds. Some established relationships with Spanish settlements. Others continued resisting the Comanche directly. The landscape itself became a weapon. For the Comanche, open plains were ideal. Their horses could move quickly. Their riders could spread across the grasslands. They could follow buffalo herds for enormous distances. They could approach an enemy camp and withdraw before a counterattack could be organized. The Apache understood this advantage, so they often relied more heavily on rugged terrain. Mountain ranges, rocky canyons, and desert country could slow mounted warriors. A steep trail could make horses less useful. A narrow canyon could limit a larger force. The Apache knew these environments intimately. This created a geographical contrast. The Comanche were strongest on the open plains. Many Apache communities were strongest in the mountains and deserts, but the boundary between these worlds was never fixed. People moved, horses moved, trade goods moved, and conflict moved with them. During the 18th century, the Comanche increasingly became a major power in the region. Their influence reached deep into areas controlled by Spain. Spanish officials became concerned about raids against settlements. Livestock could disappear, horses could be stolen, travel routes could become dangerous, and isolated settlements could be vulnerable. But the Spanish faced a problem. The Comanche were difficult to locate. A Spanish military expedition might spend days searching for a group that had already moved hundreds of miles away. The plains gave the Comanche enormous freedom of movement, so Spanish officials began exploring diplomacy. Instead of trying to defeat the Comanche completely, they sometimes tried to trade with them. This was not unusual. Trade could benefit both sides. The Spanish wanted peace. The Comanche wanted access to horses, weapons, manufactured goods, and other resources. Trade could reduce violence temporarily, but it could also strengthen the Comanche. The more horses they acquired, the more mobile they became. The more buffalo robes they could trade, the more goods they could obtain. And the more influence they gained, the more neighboring peoples had to consider their power. The Apache were caught in this changing system. Some Apache groups had their own trading relationships with the Spanish, but Comanche power increasingly disrupted those networks. The Spanish sometimes viewed the Apache as potential allies against the Comanche. This created shifting alliances. A Spanish official might negotiate with one indigenous group to counter another. An Apache leader might cooperate with the Spanish when it benefited his people, but cooperation did not mean surrendering independence. The Apache remained their own communities. They had their own leaders, their own territories, their own priorities, and their own understanding of the world. The same was true of the Comanche. The Comanche were not a centralized kingdom. Different bands had their own leaders and decisions. Some might favor peace, others might continue raiding. A Spanish official could make an agreement with one group, only to discover that another group had no interest in honoring it. This made the frontier extremely unpredictable, but it also created opportunities. Diplomacy could be used as a weapon. Trade could be used to create alliances. And temporary peace could provide time to prepare for the next conflict. For the Apache, survival required using every available option. They could fight, they could move, they could negotiate, they could trade, they could seek allies, and they could use the terrain. This flexibility allowed Apache communities to remain powerful despite enormous pressure. Yet the Comanche continued expanding. Their influence over the southern plains became so extensive that later historians would describe the region as the Comanchería. Again, this was not a conventional empire. There was no single capital, no permanent border, no central bureaucracy. Instead, it was a network of influence. Comanche bands controlled access to important hunting grounds. They influenced trade. They demanded tribute or negotiated exchanges in some areas. They raided distant settlements, and they maintained relationships with neighboring peoples. Their power was based on movement. A community that could move quickly was difficult to defeat. A warrior who could ride for hours across open country had an enormous advantage, and the Comanche became masters of this way of life. Their horses were central to everything. Children learned to ride at young ages. Horses could be trained for hunting and warfare. Large herds provided wealth, and skilled horsemen could travel farther than most rivals. The buffalo economy reinforced this power. The Comanche could hunt buffalo on a massive scale. Buffalo meat provided food. Hides became robes and coverings. Bones became tools, and surplus products could be traded. The plains provided an economic foundation that supported Comanche expansion. But there was a darker side. Raiding became an important part of frontier life. Horses were valuable, livestock was valuable, and capturing people could also become part of the conflict. Captives might be incorporated into communities. Some became laborers, some became family members, some were eventually adopted. The experience varied greatly. But captivity was an important feature of many indigenous and colonial conflicts across the region. It is also important to remember that warfare during this period did not resemble modern conventional warfare. There were no fixed battlefields. There were no continuous front lines. Instead, conflict could take the form of sudden raids, ambushes, horse theft, attacks on camps, or retaliation for earlier violence. One incident could create another. A stolen horse could lead to a raid could lead to retaliation could create another raid, and the cycle could continue for years. This cycle affected both Comanche and Apache communities, but it also affected Spanish settlers and other indigenous nations. The Southwest was becoming a web of interconnected conflicts. Then another transformation began. European diseases continued affecting indigenous populations. New markets were emerging. Firearms were becoming more common, and European powers were competing for influence across North America. The Spanish were not alone. French traders had networks of farther north and east. British interests were expanding, and eventually, the United States would enter the story. But before American expansion transformed the Southwest, the Comanche would reach the height of their influence, and the Apache would continue searching for ways to resist. The two peoples would sometimes fight each other. Sometimes they would trade. Sometimes they would share enemies. Sometimes individuals would move from one community into another. The boundaries were never as simple as later histories sometimes suggest. This was a world of people adapting to circumstances, and circumstances could change quickly. A drought could alter migration. A disease outbreak could weaken a community. A new trade route could create wealth. A new alliance could shift the balance of power, and a new weapon could change warfare. The Comanche had built an extraordinary position, but they were not invincible. They depended upon the buffalo. They depended upon horses. They depended upon mobility, and eventually, all three would be threatened. The Apache faced their own challenges. They had been pushed into difficult terrain, but the mountains and deserts could protect them. Their communities remained resilient, and their knowledge of the Southwest remained deep. The struggle between the Comanche and Apache was therefore entering a period in which neither side could simply eliminate the other. Instead, they would continue adapting. But far beyond their immediate world, another great transformation was taking place. The Spanish Empire was weakening. Mexico was beginning to emerge as an independent nation, and the political map of North America was about to change. When that happened, the Comanche and Apache would no longer be dealing primarily with Spain. They would be facing Mexico, and eventually, a rapidly expanding United States. The next century would bring soldiers, settlers, railroads, fences, firearms, and enormous changes to the plains. But for now, the grasslands remained open. The buffalo still moved across the horizon. Comanche riders still crossed the plains. Apache families still watched the mountains, and the struggle for the Southwest continued beneath the endless sky. The 18th century was drawing toward its final decades, and across the Southwest, the balance of power was becoming increasingly complicated. The Comanche had established themselves as one of the dominant forces of the southern plains. Their horses gave them speed, the buffalo gave them wealth, and the open grasslands gave them room to move. But the Apache remained determined to protect their communities. They had their own territories, their own traditions, and their own knowledge of the mountains, deserts, and plains. The struggle between the two peoples continued. Yet by this time, another relationship was becoming increasingly important. The Comanche were learning that trade could sometimes accomplish what warfare could not. Spanish officials were learning the same lesson. The Spanish had spent generations attempting to control indigenous peoples across the Southwest, but the Comanche were difficult to defeat. They could move too quickly, they could travel too far, and they understood the plains better than almost any European military force. So Spanish officials increasingly turned toward diplomacy. Peace talks were arranged, gifts were exchanged, trade agreements were discussed. Comanche leaders could receive European goods while Spanish settlements gained temporary security, but these agreements were fragile. The Comanche were not a single, centralized government. Different bands could make different decisions. A peaceful relationship with one group did not guarantee peace with another, and the same was true among Apache communities. There was no single Apache leader who controlled every Apache group. Each community had its own leadership and priorities. This decentralized political structure made the Southwest difficult for European governments to understand. Spanish officials wanted to know who was in charge, but indigenous political authority often worked through relationships rather than centralized institutions. A respected leader could influence decisions without commanding every individual. Families mattered, bands mattered, reputation mattered, and alliances could shift. For the Comanche, diplomacy became another tool of survival. They could raid when necessary. They could trade when profitable. They could negotiate when useful. And they could move when threatened. This flexibility helped create a powerful regional network. Comanche traders traveled across enormous distances. They exchanged buffalo products, horses, and other goods. European manufactured items moved in the opposite direction. Metal tools became useful. Firearms became increasingly valuable. Cloth, ammunition, and other goods entered indigenous economies. The Comanche were becoming deeply connected to a larger continental trading system, but trade did not eliminate competition. It sometimes intensified it. A group that controlled horses could obtain more goods. A group that controlled buffalo grounds could produce more hides. A group that controlled trade routes could gain influence. And the Comanche were particularly well positioned to benefit. Their horses allowed them to travel quickly between different economic zones. They could move buffalo products toward settlements. They could acquire horses from distant sources. They could trade with Spanish communities. And they could maintain connections with other indigenous nations. The Apache also participated in these networks. But their situation was increasingly difficult. Comanche expansion had disrupted some of their traditional access to the plains. Spanish settlements were expanding from the south and west, and other indigenous nations were competing for territory and resources. Some Apache groups moved deeper into the mountains. There, they could use rugged terrain to protect themselves. Others remained closer to the plains. Some sought diplomatic relationships with Spanish authorities. Others continued fighting. Again, there was no single Apache strategy. Different communities made different choices. This was not weakness, it was adaptation. The Apache had survived for generations by remaining flexible. They knew when to move. They knew when to fight. They knew when to negotiate. And they understood the landscape. The mountains could become fortresses. The desert could become protection. A hidden water source could sustain a community. A narrow canyon could make a larger force vulnerable. For the Comanche, open country was their greatest advantage. For many Apache communities, rugged country could provide the same kind of protection. The contrast between these environments shaped the conflict. But neither people existed in isolation. Pueblo communities remained important. Spanish settlements continued to grow. Other plains, peoples were watching Comanche expansion. And farther east, European colonial powers were competing for influence. North America was becoming increasingly interconnected. Then came a major political transformation. In 1803, the United States acquired the Louisiana Territory from France. The purchase dramatically expanded American claims west of the Mississippi River. At first, this seemed distant from the Comanche and Apache, but it would eventually change everything. American explorers and traders began traveling farther west. Government expeditions entered the plains. Maps were drawn, routes were recorded, and American merchants began looking for opportunities. The United States was becoming increasingly interested in the Southwest. For the Comanche, this meant another outside power was approaching. For the Apache, it meant another potential threat. But the transformation would not happen immediately. The Spanish still controlled much of the Southwest, and Spain's colonial system remained powerful. Yet Spain was facing problems of its own. European wars were weakening the empire. Political unrest was spreading, and Spanish colonies in the Americas were beginning to demand independence. In 1810, revolution erupted in Mexico. After years of conflict, Mexico achieved independence from Spain in 1821. Suddenly, the political world of the Southwest changed again. The Spanish Empire was gone. Mexico inherited control over enormous territories. But the new Mexican government faced an enormous challenge. It had to govern vast lands with limited resources. The northern frontier was distant from Mexico's major population centers. Settlements were scattered, military forces were limited, and powerful indigenous nations controlled much of the countryside. Among the strongest was the Comanche. The Mexican government soon discovered that controlling the northern frontier would be extremely difficult. Comanche raiding expanded. Horses and livestock were valuable. Mexican settlements were vulnerable, and the distances were enormous. A military force could take weeks to travel north. By the time soldiers arrived, the raiders could already be gone. The Apache also continued resisting Mexican authority. The northern frontier became increasingly unstable. Mexico tried various strategies. Fortifications were strengthened. Military colonies were established. Treaties were negotiated. Rewards were offered. But the government lacked the resources to completely control the region. The Comanche understood this weakness. Their power reached across enormous areas. They could raid into Mexican territory and return to the plains. They could trade with different communities, and they could use their knowledge of the landscape to avoid pursuit. This period would eventually become one of the most powerful eras of Comanche influence. The Comanchería was reaching its greatest extent. It was a vast world of movement and influence. Comanche bands controlled access to important territories. They interacted with Pueblo peoples. They traded with new Mexican settlements. They raided Mexican communities. And they competed with Apache groups. Yet this power came with a cost. Constant warfare was dangerous. Maintaining large horse herds required resources. Buffalo herds had to remain healthy, and neighboring peoples were constantly adapting. The Apache were learning from Comanche tactics, Mexican settlements were changing their defenses, and American traders were approaching from the east. The world was becoming more crowded. The days when the southern plains could be controlled almost entirely by indigenous powers were beginning to fade. But neither the Comanche nor the Apache could have known how quickly the next transformation would come. Within a few decades, American settlers would begin moving into Texas. Texas would break away from Mexico. The United States would expand westward, and the old political boundaries of the Southwest would begin collapsing. The Comanche and Apache would find themselves caught between expanding nations. Their struggle with one another would continue, but another struggle was approaching, one that would eventually threaten both peoples. The 19th century was beginning. The old Spanish world was disappearing, Mexico was rising, the United States was growing, and across the southern plains, Comanche riders still moved beneath the open sky. Apache families still held their ground in the mountains and deserts. The buffalo still filled the grasslands. For a little while longer, the old world remained, but it was changing. And the next generation would witness transformations that no one on those plains could yet imagine. The 19th century had begun. The Spanish Empire had disappeared from the political map of the Southwest, and Mexico now controlled the enormous northern territories that Spain had once claimed. But Mexico inherited a difficult frontier. Its settlements were scattered, its roads were long, its military forces were limited. And across the grasslands, the Comanche remained one of the most powerful forces in the region. The Apache remained as well, holding territories across the mountains, deserts, and plains. For both peoples, the arrival of Mexico created new challenges, but it also created new opportunities. The old Spanish trading networks did not disappear overnight. Instead, they changed hands. New Mexican settlements continued trading with indigenous communities. Horses, livestock, hides, weapons, metal goods, and manufactured products moved through the frontier. The Comanche understood the value of this economy. They had become skilled traders as well as warriors. Their horse herds were enormous sources of wealth. A good horse could be traded for valuable goods. A herd could support a family, and a large supply of horses could support military power. But there was another resource that remained central to life on the plains: the buffalo. Millions of buffalo still moved across the grasslands. For the Comanche, buffalo provided food, hides, bones, sinew, and many other useful materials. The animal supported an entire economy. A successful buffalo hunt could provide enough food for a community for days or weeks. The hides could become robes and coverings. The meat could be dried and stored. Bones could be shaped into tools. Nothing was simply wasted. The buffalo and the horse together created the foundation of Comanche power. One provided mobility, the other provided sustenance. Together they made the southern plains extraordinarily valuable, and the Comanche knew how to use that advantage. Their bands could move quickly, they could establish temporary camps, they could follow the buffalo, they could trade with distant settlements, and they could launch raids when necessary. Raiding was not always simply about destruction. Horses and livestock were valuable commodities. A successful raid could increase wealth and strengthen a band's position. But raids also created enemies. Mexican settlers feared them. Apache communities feared them. And eventually, American settlers would fear them as well. This created cycles of retaliation. A raid could lead to a counter-raid. A stolen herd could lead to revenge. A captured person could become the reason for another attack. The frontier was therefore filled with memories of violence, but it was also filled with cooperation. The same communities that fought could sometimes trade. A person might have enemies in one season and trading partners in another. The line between warfare and commerce was often surprisingly thin. For the Apache, this changing world was especially challenging. Comanche expansion had already pushed many Apache groups away from important portions of the southern plains. Some moved toward the mountains, others settled closer to Spanish or Mexican communities. Some continued hunting across the plains when they could, and some sought alliances against the Comanche. The Lipan Apache, for example, became deeply involved in the changing political landscape of Texas and northern Mexico. Their position was complicated. They were dealing with Comanche pressure from one direction and Spanish and Mexican expansion from another. They sometimes sought support from colonial authorities, but cooperation with one outside power could create new problems with another. The Apache therefore continued relying on flexibility. They moved, they negotiated, they fought, they traded, and they used the terrain. The mountains and deserts could protect them from mounted Comanche forces. But the open plains remained dangerous. The Comanche were difficult opponents. They had mastered mounted warfare. They could approach quickly. They could attack from different directions. And they could disappear into the distance. Their mobility made traditional military pursuit extremely difficult. Mexican commanders repeatedly discovered this. A military expedition might travel north with soldiers and supplies, but the Comanche could simply move away. The Mexican army could occupy a settlement, yet the surrounding countryside remained beyond its control. The government therefore struggled to establish lasting authority. This weakness created opportunities for the Comanche. By the early 19th century, Comanche influence extended across enormous parts of the southern plains. Their sphere of power reached into present-day Texas, New Mexico, Oklahoma, Colorado, and Kansas. The Comanchería was becoming a dominant force, but there was an important distinction. It was not a formal empire. There was no Comanche emperor, no central capital, no permanent army stationed across the region. Instead, power came from relationships, from mobility, from reputation, from trade, from access to buffalo, and from the ability to punish those who threatened Comanche interests. Different bands operated independently, yet outsiders often recognized the broader power of the Comanche. Their influence was so extensive that Mexican officials sometimes negotiated with them as though they were dealing with a major regional power, because they were. Meanwhile, the Apache were adapting to the new political environment. Some Apache leaders understood that the growing Mexican government could potentially be used against Comanche rivals. Diplomatic relationships were developed. Trade agreements were attempted, but Mexico could not always provide the protection it promised. Its northern frontier was too large, its resources were too limited, and its government was frequently distracted by internal political struggles. The Comanche therefore remained powerful. Then another force began appearing more frequently: American traders. The United States had acquired the Louisiana Territory in 1803. Explorers and merchants were moving farther west. The Santa Fe Trail would eventually connect Missouri with New Mexico. American traders entered a region where Comanche power was already established. At first, the relationship was largely commercial. American merchants wanted access to Mexican markets. They traveled across the plains. They encountered indigenous communities. They traded manufactured goods for local products. And they learned that survival required respecting the power of the people who controlled the land. Some traders developed relationships with Comanche leaders. They exchanged goods, they learned routes, they established trust. Others encountered conflict. The frontier was changing. American expansion was approaching from the east. Mexican authority was weakening, and indigenous nations still controlled much of the land. For the Comanche, this was an opportunity. They could trade with American merchants. They could acquire new goods. They could learn about the expanding American world. For the Apache, the situation was more uncertain. A new power was approaching, and it was not yet clear whether the Americans would become trading partners or enemies. That question would soon be answered. In 1821, Mexico had gained independence from Spain. By the 1830s, political conflict in Texas was intensifying. American settlers were arriving in large numbers. They wanted land. They wanted independence from Mexico. And they were entering territories already occupied by indigenous nations. The Comanche watched this expansion carefully. The Apache watched as well. The arrival of settlers meant new livestock, new roads, new settlements, and new opportunities for trade, but it also meant competition. Every new settlement reduced the amount of open land available for hunting and movement. Every new ranch brought livestock that could become targets for raiding. Every new military post increased the pressure on indigenous territory. The old frontier was beginning to disappear. Fences did not yet stretch across the plains. Railroads had not arrived. The buffalo still dominated the grasslands, but the process had begun. The Southwest was becoming a place where competing ideas of land were colliding. For the Comanche and Apache, land was connected to movement, hunting, family, and survival. For incoming settlers, land increasingly represented private property. Those two ideas would eventually collide with enormous consequences. And as American settlement expanded, the old struggle between the Comanche and Apache would become part of a much larger conflict. The two peoples had been competing for territory for generations, but now both were facing a new and rapidly growing power, the United States. The future of the Southwest was about to change forever. The 19th century was bringing a new power into the Southwest. The United States was expanding, its settlers were moving west. Its merchants were traveling across the plains, and its government was beginning to imagine the continent as a country stretching from one ocean to the other. For the Comanche and Apache, this expansion created a new reality. They had spent generations dealing with Spanish and Mexican authorities. Now, another nation was approaching. At first, the relationship was not entirely hostile. American traders entered the region. They followed trails across the plains. They carried manufactured goods toward New Mexico. They traded cloth, metal tools, firearms, ammunition, and other items. The Comanche quickly recognized the possibilities. Trade could bring valuable goods without warfare. American merchants also discovered that the Comanche were an important economic power. They controlled access to enormous hunting grounds. They possessed large horse herds, and they knew the routes across the plains. Some traders developed relationships with Comanche leaders. They learned to negotiate. They learned that the Comanche could not simply be ignored. But American settlement was expanding, and settlers did not always share the same interests as traders. Settlers wanted land, they wanted farms, they wanted ranches, they wanted permanent communities. The Comanche way of life depended upon movement. Their economy depended heavily on hunting. Their political power depended upon access to territory. The more settlers arrived, the more difficult that way of life became. Texas became one of the most important places where these worlds collided. After years of conflict, Texas declared independence from Mexico in 1836. The new Republic of Texas claimed enormous territory. But claiming land on a map did not mean controlling it. Much of the countryside remained under indigenous control. The Comanche were especially powerful. Apache groups also remained active across parts of the region. The Republic of Texas therefore faced a major problem. Its government wanted settlers to move west. But settlers were entering a landscape where powerful indigenous nations already lived. Conflict followed. Comanche raids became a major concern for Texan settlers. At the same time, Comanche communities viewed the expanding settlements as a threat to their own territory. Both sides believed they were defending themselves, and both sides responded with violence. The result was a cycle that became increasingly difficult to stop. A settler settlement might be attacked. Texan militia would retaliate. Comanche warriors would respond. Another settlement would be attacked. More soldiers would be sent west, and the cycle continued. But there were also attempts at peace. Treaties were negotiated, meetings were held, leaders exchanged gifts, promises were made, yet peace remained fragile. Different Comanche bands had different interests. Texan settlers did not always agree with their own government, and misunderstandings could quickly destroy trust. One of the most famous moments came in 1840. Comanche leaders traveled to San Antonio to negotiate with Texan officials. The meeting became known as the Council House Fight. The Comanche delegation arrived expecting negotiations. The Texans wanted the release of captives. The negotiations broke down. Violence erupted. Comanche leaders were killed. The event had devastating consequences. Instead of creating peace, it intensified the conflict. Comanche retaliation followed. The Great Comanche Raid of 1840 reached deep into Texas. Towns and settlements were attacked. The raid demonstrated something the Texans already knew, but could not easily solve. The Comanche could travel enormous distances. They could strike far from their main territories, and they could return quickly. The Texas government responded with military campaigns, but the frontier remained difficult to control. Then, in 1846, the United States went to war with Mexico. The consequences for the Southwest were enormous. The United States defeated Mexico, and in 1848, Mexico ceded vast territories to the United States. Suddenly, the Comanche and Apache were dealing with an even more powerful government. The American frontier had moved directly into their world. New Mexico became part of the United States. Texas was already American, and American settlers continued moving west. The United States now had an enormous interest in controlling the plains and Southwest. But the federal government faced a difficult reality. The Comanches still controlled much of the southern plains. Apache groups remained powerful in the Southwest, and American military posts were scattered across enormous distances. The United States therefore began using both diplomacy and military force. Treaties were negotiated, reservations were discussed, trade relationships were encouraged. But settlers continued arriving. This was the fundamental problem. American officials often wanted indigenous peoples confined to specific areas. Comanche communities wanted to continue moving across their homeland. Apache communities wanted the same. The idea of a fixed reservation conflicted with older patterns of movement. A map could draw a boundary, but a buffalo herd did not recognize it. A horse did not recognize it. A river did not recognize it. And a family whose livelihood depended on seasonal movement could not simply stop at an invisible line. This conflict would become more intense as the American population increased. The United States was also developing a stronger military presence. Forts appeared across the frontier. Soldiers protected settlements and roads. Wagons carried supplies west, and travelers became more numerous. The Old World was shrinking. The Comanche still possessed enormous power, but the conditions that supported that power were beginning to change. The buffalo were still abundant. The plains were still open, but more settlers meant more pressure. More soldiers meant more conflict, and more trade meant greater dependence on outside goods. For the Apache, the situation was equally complicated. Some groups were fighting the United States, others were negotiating, some were trading, others were trying to avoid contact altogether. The Apache were spread across a vast region. Different communities experienced American expansion differently, but everywhere, the pressure was increasing. One of the most important Apache leaders of the 19th century would emerge from the Chiricahua Apache. His name was Cochise. He would become one of the best-known indigenous leaders of the American Southwest. But the conflict that eventually made him famous was still developing. The Apache were entering a period of enormous pressure from American soldiers, settlers, and miners. The Comanche were experiencing similar pressures from the north and east. For the first time, both peoples were facing a power capable of eventually transforming the entire region. The United States possessed more soldiers, more settlers, more industrial resources, more firearms, and eventually the railroads. But in the 1840s and early 1850s, The Old World still survived. Comanche riders continued crossing the plains. Apache families continued moving through mountain and desert country. Buffalo still covered the grasslands, and the frontier still seemed endless. The United States believed the West could be settled. The Comanche and Apache believed they already had a homeland. Those two visions could not easily coexist. And as American expansion accelerated, the struggle for the Southwest would become larger than the conflict between Comanche and Apache. It would become a struggle between indigenous nations and an expanding continental power. The next decades would bring some of the most dramatic changes the Southwest had ever seen. Railroads would arrive, buffalo herds would collapse, military campaigns would intensify, and the world that had supported Comanche and Apache independence for generations would begin disappearing. But for now, the riders still had room to move, the mountains still offered shelter, the buffalo still darkened the plains, and the struggle was far from over. The 1850s brought a new intensity to the struggle for the Southwest. American settlement was accelerating. Wagons crossed the plains. Military forts appeared farther west. New roads connected distant settlements, and prospectors were beginning to search the mountains for valuable minerals. For the Comanche and Apache, the changes were becoming impossible to ignore. The world was getting smaller. For generations, distance had protected indigenous independence. A community could move away from danger. A band could travel beyond the reach of an approaching army. A hunting party could disappear into the plains. But now, American settlements were spreading in every direction. The pressure was no longer coming from a single frontier. It was expanding across the landscape. For the Comanche, the greatest challenge remained the southern plains. Their homeland was increasingly crossed by American travelers. The old trails were becoming roads, trading posts were becoming permanent settlements, and ranchers were bringing larger numbers of cattle into territories where buffalo had once dominated. At first, the Comanche continued to exercise enormous influence. Their riders could still travel hundreds of miles. Their horse herds remained impressive, and their knowledge of the plains was unmatched. But every new settlement created another point of tension. Livestock could wander into Comanche hunting territories. Comanche horses could be taken. Settlers could move into traditional hunting grounds, and raids could follow. The cycle of retaliation continued. But there was a difference now. The United States had resources that previous governments had not possessed. It could build forts, it could send soldiers, it could establish roads, and it could continually bring more settlers into the region. The Comanche were facing a power that could keep returning. The Apache faced a similar problem in the Southwest. Their territories included mountains and deserts that made military pursuit difficult. This gave them an advantage. The rugged landscape could slow American soldiers. Apache warriors knew hidden trails. They knew water sources. They knew where horses could travel. They could disappear into country that outsiders found difficult to navigate. Among the Chiricahua Apache, a leader named Cochise was becoming increasingly important. He was respected for his leadership, his knowledge of the land, and his ability to understand the changing political situation. For years, the relationship between Apache communities and American authorities had been complicated. There was trade, there were negotiations, there were periods of peace, and there was violence. Then came a series of events that would transform the relationship. In 1861, an American military officer accused Cochise and other Apache people of kidnapping and theft. Cochise denied the accusations, but the situation escalated. He attempted to leave the meeting. Soldiers tried to stop him. Cochise escaped by cutting through the canvas of a tent. The confrontation became known as the Bascom Affair. Its consequences were enormous. Cochise and his followers began a prolonged war against American forces. The conflict would last for years. The Apache Wars were not a single continuous war. They were a series of conflicts involving different Apache groups, the United States, Mexico, settlers, and sometimes other indigenous nations. The terrain was enormous. The fighting could occur in deserts, mountains, valleys, and remote passes. For American soldiers, the landscape itself was often an enemy. A patrol might travel for days without finding its target. Apache warriors could appear suddenly. Then they could disappear. The same mobility that had helped indigenous peoples survive for centuries was now being used against the American military. The Comanche were experiencing similar military pressure farther east. But their situation had another vulnerability: the buffalo. For generations, the buffalo had supported Comanche life. They were food, they were clothing, they were shelter, they were tools, they were trade goods, and they were central to the economy of the Southern Plains. The United States expansion brought another economic force: commercial hunting. As railroads expanded westward, buffalo hides became increasingly valuable. Hunters began killing enormous numbers of animals. At first, the destruction was difficult to imagine. The plains had once contained vast herds. Travelers could see buffalo stretching across the horizon. But commercial hunting changed the scale of killing. Hunters could now reach areas that had previously been difficult to access. Railroads could transport hides and meat. Markets existed far away, and the animals were increasingly treated as commodities. The Comanche understood what was happening. If the buffalo disappeared, their entire way of life would be threatened. This was not simply a problem of food. It was a crisis of culture and independence. Without buffalo, hunting economies would collapse. Without hunting, mobility would become harder. Without mobility, Comanche power would weaken. The United States military also recognized the connection. Some American officials understood that destroying the buffalo herds could reduce indigenous resistance. The logic was harsh. If the buffalo disappeared, the Comanche would lose a major source of food and economic independence. And without that independence, they would be more likely to accept reservation life. The destruction of the buffalo therefore became connected to the larger campaign against the Plains peoples. Meanwhile, the railroads were approaching. Tracks stretched farther west, towns grew around them, military supplies could be transported faster, settlers could travel farther, and the open plains were gradually being transformed. Fences began appearing. Private ranches expanded. Land that had once been crossed freely was increasingly claimed as property. The Comanche way of life depended upon movement. The new American system depended upon fixed boundaries. Those two systems were fundamentally different. For the Comanche, the question was not simply whether they could survive a battle, it was whether they could continue living as they had lived for generations. The Apache faced a different but related challenge. Their mountain strongholds could protect them from soldiers, but mining settlements were entering their territories. Prospectors searched for silver, gold, copper, and other resources. Roads followed. Settlers followed the roads. Military forts followed the settlers. And the landscape became increasingly occupied. Apache leaders understood that the arrival of miners could be as disruptive as the arrival of soldiers. A mining camp could become a permanent settlement. A permanent settlement could become a town, and a town could bring hundreds of people into territory that had once been controlled by Apache communities. The pressure was relentless. Yet neither the Comanche nor the Apache surrendered easily. Resistance continued. Apache leaders such as Cochise used the mountains and deserts to their advantage. Comanche warriors continued defending their hunting grounds. But the balance was changing. American military power was growing. Railroads were expanding. Settlements were multiplying, and the buffalo were disappearing. The Old Southwest was being transformed from the outside inward. Then came the Civil War. In 1861, the United States descended into its own internal conflict. Federal troops were withdrawn from many western forts. For a brief period, the military presence in parts of the frontier weakened. The Comanche and Apache recognized the opportunity, but the Civil War also brought new political changes. Texas joined the Confederacy. New Mexico territory became a battlefield. Confederate and Union forces competed for control of the Southwest. Indigenous nations had to navigate another complicated political landscape. Some groups negotiated with one side, others fought. Some attempted to remain independent. The war temporarily distracted the United States from its Western campaigns, but it would not last forever. When the Civil War ended in 1865, the United States emerged with an enormous military capacity. Thousands of soldiers became available. Railroad expansion accelerated. Settlers moved west, and federal attention returned to the plains and Southwest. For the Comanche and Apache, the most dangerous period was approaching. The Old World had survived the arrival of Spain. It had survived Mexico. It had survived earlier American expansion. But now, the United States possessed the population, transportation networks, weapons, and industrial power to permanently transform the region. The Comanche still had horses. The Apache still had mountains. But the world around them was changing faster than ever, and the next struggle would determine whether they could remain independent or whether they would be forced onto reservations. The age of the open frontier was beginning to close. The Civil War had ended. The United States emerged from the conflict more powerful than before. Its armies had grown enormous. Its railroads were expanding. Its factories were producing weapons and supplies at an unprecedented scale. And the federal government was once again turning its attention toward the western frontier. For the Comanche and Apache, this marked the beginning of one of the most difficult periods in their history. The world they had known was changing rapidly. The buffalo herds were shrinking. Settlements were multiplying. Military forts were becoming permanent. And the open spaces that had once allowed indigenous communities to move freely were slowly being divided. For the Comanche, the southern plains were still home. Their horse herds remained important. Their knowledge of the land remained extraordinary. And their warriors continued to resist American expansion. But the conditions that had made Comanche power possible were disappearing. The most serious threat was the buffalo. For generations, enormous herds had crossed the Great Plains. They provided food, clothing, shelter, tools, and trade goods. The Comanche economy was deeply connected to them, but commercial hunting was destroying the herds. Professional hunters traveled alongside the expanding railroads. They killed buffalo for their hides. Sometimes the meat was left behind. The scale of the slaughter was difficult to comprehend. Animals that had once numbered in the millions were disappearing within a few decades. The consequences were devastating. Without buffalo, Comanche communities could no longer depend upon their traditional hunting economy. Food became harder to obtain. trade goods became scarcer, and the independence that had allowed Comanche bands to remain beyond the control of governments was weakening. American military leaders understood this. Some openly recognized that reducing the buffalo herds would make it harder for Plains peoples to resist. The destruction of the buffalo therefore became more than an environmental disaster. It became part of the larger transformation of the plains. The railroad accelerated everything. A train could cross country much faster than a wagon. Supplies could reach military forts. Settlers could travel west. Buffalo hides could be shipped to distant markets. Towns could grow almost overnight. The landscape was becoming connected to a national economy, and the Comanche were increasingly surrounded by it. They responded with resistance. Raiding continued, military campaigns followed, but the old strategy of moving farther away was becoming less effective. There was simply less open country available. Meanwhile, the Apache were facing their own intense struggle in the Southwest. The Chiricahua Apache remained a powerful force in the mountains of what is now southern Arizona and New Mexico. Their leader, Cochise, had spent years fighting American forces. The mountains gave him an enormous advantage. His warriors knew the trails. They knew hidden water sources. They knew where horses could travel. They understood the landscape in ways that many American soldiers did not. For years, American troops struggled to defeat them, but Cochise also understood that endless warfare had a cost. His people were suffering. Communities were being disrupted. Families were losing members, and the arrival of more settlers made the situation increasingly difficult. Cochise eventually began considering peace. In 1872, a major agreement was reached between Cochise and the United States. The agreement established a reservation for the Chiricahua Apache in part of their traditional homeland. For a time, it offered hope. Cochise could remain in a region familiar to his people. The Apache could live with greater independence, and the fighting could end. But peace would not remain secure. Cochise died in 1874. After his death, the political situation changed. American officials increasingly wanted greater control over the Chiricahua. The reservation was eventually reduced and later abandoned as federal policy shifted. Apache leaders such as Victorio and Nana continued resisting. Another famous leader, Geronimo, would later become the symbol most associated with the final Apache resistance. But the struggle was not simply about individual warriors. It was about the survival of communities. It was about land. It was about movement. And it was about whether indigenous peoples would retain control over their own lives. The Comanche were facing the same fundamental question. American officials increasingly believed that indigenous peoples should be placed on reservations. There, they could be supervised. Children could be educated in government schools. Traditional hunting could be restricted, and communities could be encouraged to adopt farming and other American economic practices. For the Comanche, this represented a dramatic change. Their society had been built around mobility. Now they were being asked to remain in one place. The reservation system was not simply a change in location. It was a change in an entire way of life. Imagine a people whose economy depended upon movement being told that they must remain within fixed boundaries. Imagine hunters being told they could no longer freely follow buffalo. Imagine families whose horses represented wealth being pressured to abandon their old economic system. This was the challenge facing the Comanche. Some leaders negotiated, others resisted. Many understood that military resistance was becoming increasingly difficult. The United States could send soldiers by railroad. It could establish forts. It could replace losses. It could bring supplies from distant cities. The Comanche could not replace buffalo herds so easily. They could not create new open land, and they could not stop the railroads from advancing. By the 1870s, the pressure was becoming overwhelming. Comanche resistance continued, but the great era of independent Comanche power was ending. The final campaigns of the Southern Plains were approaching. The U.S. military began concentrating forces against the remaining free-ranging indigenous groups. Comanche, Kiowa, Southern Cheyenne, and other Plains peoples were increasingly pushed toward reservation life. The Red River War of 1874 to 1875 became one of the decisive conflicts. The Southern Plains peoples had strong reasons to resist. The buffalo were disappearing, their hunting grounds were being occupied, their freedom of movement was shrinking, and federal policies were forcing them toward reservations. The conflict was intense. American troops moved across the plains. Indigenous warriors attempted to defend their communities, but the conditions were different from earlier wars. The military could now use railroads and supply lines. It could maintain long campaigns. It could surround areas of resistance, and it could continue advancing. Eventually, the resistance weakened. Many Comanche families surrendered and moved on to reservations. Among the most important figures of this period was Quanah Parker. He was of mixed Comanche and European American ancestry and became one of the best-known Comanche leaders of the late 19th century. Quanah had experienced the world of the free-ranging Comanche. He also understood that the political reality was changing. After the final resistance ended, he became an important leader of the reservation-era Comanche. His life would symbolize the difficult transition between two worlds. The old Comanche world had not simply vanished. Its memories remained, its stories remained, its language remained. But the political independence of the Comanchería had been broken. The Apache experienced a similar transition. Some groups remained resistant for years. Others entered reservations through treaties and negotiations. But eventually most Apache communities were also confined to reservations. For both peoples, the era of the open frontier had ended. The mountains still stood. The plains still stretched toward the horizon. But fences, forts, railroads, towns, and reservations had transformed the landscape. The horse remained important. The memory of the buffalo remained. The stories of warriors remained. But the old way of life could no longer continue unchanged. And yet this was not the end of the Comanche. It was not the end of the Apache. The next chapter would be about adaptation. They would face schools, new laws, new economies, new forms of government, and enormous pressure to abandon their languages and traditions. But they would also find ways to preserve them. The struggle for the Southwest was entering a new phase. The weapons had changed. The battlefield had changed. But the central question remained the same. How could a people survive while holding on to who they were? The great wars of the Southern Plains were ending. By the late 1870s, the world that had once belonged to Comanche riders, buffalo hunters, and free-ranging Apache communities had been transformed. The buffalo herds were disappearing. Railroads crossed the plains. American settlements continued to expand. Military forts had become permanent, and reservations increasingly replaced the open territories where indigenous communities had once moved according to their own traditions. For the Comanche, this transformation was especially painful. Their power had been built around mobility. A Comanche family could follow the buffalo. A hunting party could travel enormous distances. Horses could carry people and possessions across the plains. But now, movement was restricted. The reservation became the center of life. The old Comanchería was gone, yet the Comanche people remained. and surviving this new world required a different kind of strength. One of the most important leaders of this transition was Quanah Parker. Quanah had experienced the old world. His mother, Cynthia Ann Parker, had been captured as a child and later became part of Comanche society. Quanah grew up within the Comanche world. He became a respected warrior and leader, but he also witnessed the collapse of the free-ranging Comanche way of life. When resistance became increasingly difficult, Quanah eventually chose a different path. He entered the reservation system and became an important intermediary between Comanche people and American officials. His decision was controversial. Some saw accommodation as necessary for survival. Others viewed it as surrender. But history rarely gives people simple choices. By the 1870s, the United States possessed enormous military advantages. The buffalo were nearly gone. The railroads had transformed transportation. Settlers had filled much of the plains. Continuing the old war could mean greater suffering for Comanche families. So Quanah began working within the new political system. He learned how to negotiate. He traveled. He met American officials. He represented Comanche interests. And he tried to protect his people as they adjusted to reservation life. The Apache faced similar challenges. After decades of warfare, many Apache communities were placed on reservations. But reservation life was not peaceful in the sense that the fighting had simply ended. A new struggle had begun. The federal government wanted indigenous people to change. Officials wanted them to farm. They wanted children to attend schools. They wanted traditional ceremonies reduced or eliminated. They wanted English to replace native languages. They wanted indigenous communities to become more like American society. For the Comanche and Apache, these policies could feel like another kind of invasion. The battlefield had disappeared, but pressure remained. Children became one of the main targets of federal assimilation policies. Government and missionary schools were established. Some children were educated relatively close to their families. Others were sent much farther away. At boarding schools, indigenous children were often required to wear unfamiliar clothing. Their hair could be cut. They were encouraged or sometimes forced to speak English. Traditional practices could be punished. The purpose was not simply to teach reading and arithmetic. It was to transform identity. The policy was based on the belief that indigenous cultures should eventually disappear. But cultures are not easily erased. Comanche families continued speaking their language. Apache families continued teaching traditions. Grandparents continued telling stories. Ceremonies continued when people could practice them privately. And traditional knowledge remained within families. The federal government could control schools. It could control reservations, but it could not completely control memory. The reservation era also brought economic changes. The old buffalo economy had collapsed. Families had to find new ways to survive. Agriculture became more important. Cattle raising became important in some communities. Wage labor became increasingly necessary. Crafts and trade provided additional opportunities. But the transition was difficult. Reservation lands were often limited. Resources could be scarce. Government supplies were not always sufficient. And federal officials frequently controlled economic decisions. The Comanche and Apache were being asked to become farmers in environments that did not always support the kind of farming officials envisioned. Their traditional economies had been adapted to the land. The new economy was imposed from outside. This created hardship. Yet adaptation continued. Horses remained important. Ranching developed. Families learned new agricultural techniques. Some people entered American schools and professions. Others remained closely connected to traditional life. Many did both. This mixture would become one of the defining characteristics of modern Comanche and Apache identity. A person could live in a modern American town and still know their clan relationships. They could work for wages and still participate in ceremonies. They could speak English and still preserve their native language. They could attend a government school and still learn traditional knowledge from their grandparents. Identity did not disappear simply because circumstances changed, but the pressure was real. Languages were especially vulnerable. When children were educated primarily in English, fewer young people became fluent in their ancestral languages. As older speakers passed away, communities faced the possibility of losing knowledge that had been carried for generations. This became a major concern among both Comanche and Apache communities. Language preservation eventually became part of a broader cultural revitalization movement. Teachers began developing language programs. Elders became recognized as important sources of knowledge. Families recorded stories. Communities created cultural centers. And younger people increasingly became interested in learning about their heritage. The process was not easy. Some languages had already lost many fluent speakers, but the effort itself became a form of cultural resistance. The same was true of traditional arts. Comanche and Apache artists continued creating beadwork, clothing, baskets, pottery, paintings, and other forms of art. These traditions adapted to modern markets. Some artists created pieces specifically for sale. Others created objects for cultural or ceremonial purposes. But in both cases, skills were passed from one generation to another. The reservation era, therefore, did not simply produce cultural loss. It also produced cultural adaptation. The Comanche and Apache were learning to survive inside a system they had not chosen. They were navigating federal law. They were dealing with government agents. They were sending children to schools. They were entering the American economy, and at the same time they were protecting whatever they could. The story of Quanah Parker illustrates this complicated process. He wore American-style clothing at times. He participated in American political and social events. He developed relationships with prominent Americans. But he also remained deeply connected to Comanche identity. He continued to speak for his people. He participated in Comanche traditions. And he understood that survival sometimes required negotiation rather than warfare. His life became a symbol of the transition from the old Comanchería to the reservation era. But the transition was not complete. Even after the major wars ended, conflicts over land continued. Federal policies could reduce reservation lands. Railroads and settlers sought access to resources. Allotment policies attempted to divide communal lands into individual parcels. The Dawes Act of 1887 became one of the most important examples of this approach. The federal government believed that breaking tribal land into individual allotments would encourage indigenous people to become private farmers. But the policy also weakened communal landholding. Surplus lands could be sold or transferred to non-indigenous buyers. Over time, Native communities lost enormous amounts of land through allotment and related policies. For the Comanche and Apache, land loss was another reminder that the end of warfare did not mean the end of pressure. The struggle had simply moved into politics and law. Yet they continued. Families remained, communities remained, languages struggled but survived, traditions adapted, and leaders emerged who understood that the future would require a different kind of resistance. The 19th century had been an era of horses, buffalo, raids, treaties, and battles. The 20th century would be different. the struggle would increasingly take place in classrooms, courtrooms, tribal councils, and government offices. The Comanche and Apache would have to learn how to defend their rights without armies of warriors riding across the plains, and they would discover that survival could take many forms. Sometimes it could mean speaking a language. Sometimes it could mean teaching a child a traditional story. Sometimes it could mean protecting a piece of land. Sometimes it could mean entering a courtroom. And sometimes it could simply mean remembering. The old world was gone, but the people who had lived in it were still here, and they were preparing for the century ahead. The 20th century began with the Comanche and Apache living in a world that was very different from the one their grandparents had known. The open plains were no longer open in the same way. Railroads crossed the country, towns were growing, farms and ranches occupied land that had once been traveled freely. The buffalo herds were gone, and the reservation system had become a permanent part of life. But the Comanche and Apache were still here. Their challenge now was not simply surviving military campaigns. It was surviving a system designed to change who they were. Federal officials believed that indigenous people should eventually become part of mainstream American society. They called this process assimilation. Education became one of the main tools. Children were sent to schools where they were expected to learn English, American customs, and agricultural skills. In some schools, traditional clothing was discouraged. Hair was cut. Native languages were forbidden or punished. Traditional ceremonies were treated as obstacles to progress. The intention was clear. The government wanted the next generation to become culturally American, but the results were never as complete as officials hoped. Children remembered home. They remembered the words their grandparents had spoken. They remembered stories. They remembered songs. And when they returned to their communities, many brought pieces of their school experiences with them while still carrying the culture they had been told to abandon. This created a complicated generation. Some young people gained valuable education. They learned English. They learned reading and writing. They acquired skills that could help them find employment. But many also experienced loneliness, punishment, and cultural disconnection. The boarding school experience became one of the deepest wounds of 20th century indigenous history. For Comanche and Apache families, the loss was not simply about children being away from home. It was about the possibility of losing the knowledge that connected generations. A language spoken by a grandparent might not be understood by a grandchild. A traditional story might not be passed down. A ceremony might become harder to maintain, and once knowledge disappears, bringing it back can be extremely difficult. Yet cultural traditions did not vanish. They survived quietly. Families continued practicing traditions whenever possible. Elders remained teachers. Some ceremonies continued. Traditional foods were prepared. Arts were practiced. And native languages continued to be spoken in homes and communities. The federal government could create policies, but it could not completely control what happened inside every family. At the same time, the Comanche and Apache were adjusting to the modern American economy. The old buffalo economy was gone. Hunting was no longer the foundation of life. Instead, families increasingly depended on ranching, farming, wage labor, government employment, and small businesses. Some Comanche became skilled ranchers. Horses remained culturally important. Some Apache communities developed cattle operations. Others worked in agriculture, mining, forestry, tourism, or nearby towns. The transition was difficult, but it also created new possibilities. Young people could travel, they could attend colleges, they could learn professions that had previously been unavailable to their grandparents. They could become teachers, doctors, lawyers, soldiers, artists, and government officials. And some returned home with new skills. This gradually changed the political landscape. The old reservation system had been designed around federal control, but Native communities increasingly wanted self-government. They wanted greater control over education. They wanted greater control over land. They wanted their own courts and institutions. They wanted their governments to speak directly for their people. Across the United States, Native nations began pushing for greater self-determination. The Comanche and Apache were part of this broader movement. The idea was not to return to the 19th century. The buffalo economy could not simply be restored. The old political boundaries could not simply be recreated. Instead, the goal was to build a future in which Native nations could participate in modern America without surrendering their identity. This was a major change in political thinking. For decades, federal officials had assumed that tribal nations would eventually disappear. Now, Native leaders were saying something very different. We are still here, and we have the right to govern ourselves. The struggle for sovereignty therefore became increasingly important. Tribal governments developed stronger institutions. Leaders learned how to work with federal agencies. They negotiated over land. They defended treaty rights. They worked on education. They developed economic programs. And they represented their communities in Washington and state governments. This political development did not happen overnight. It was built through decades of experience. Every generation learned from the mistakes and successes of the previous one. Meanwhile, the wider United States was changing rapidly. Cars replaced horses in many places. Telephones connected distant communities. Radio entered American homes, then television, then airplanes. The modern world was arriving. For many young Comanche and Apache people, the reservation was no longer isolated. They could travel to cities. They could serve in the military. They could work outside their communities. And they could return home. This created a new kind of cultural identity. A person could live in two worlds. They could be part of modern America while remaining deeply connected to their native nation. This became particularly visible during times of war. Comanche and Apache men served in the American military during the 20th century. They fought in World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam, and later conflicts. Their military service reflected the complicated relationship between Native nations and the United States. The government had once fought against their ancestors. Now their descendants were serving in the American armed forces. For many Native families, military service was a source of pride. It was also another way of participating in the broader country while maintaining tribal identity. But the 20th century brought other challenges. Economic inequality remained serious. Reservation communities often lacked infrastructure that was common elsewhere in America. Roads could be poor. Health care could be limited. Employment opportunities could be scarce. And many families continued to experience poverty. These problems were connected to decades of land loss, federal policy, and limited economic opportunities. Yet Native communities were increasingly organizing to address them. Education became one of the most powerful tools. A college degree could open doors. A law degree could help defend tribal rights. A medical degree could help improve health care. A teaching degree could help strengthen schools. And historical knowledge could help younger generations understand why sovereignty mattered. The past was becoming a resource for the future. This was especially important because the public image of Native Americans had often been shaped by movies and popular culture. Hollywood frequently portrayed Comanche and Apache people as mysterious warriors, enemies, or symbols of the old frontier. These images rarely showed the full complexity of their societies. They rarely showed families, farmers, artists, children, political leaders, teachers, or the ordinary lives of Native people. Comanche and Apache communities increasingly began telling their own stories. Historians documented oral traditions, museums preserved artifacts, artists created new representations, elders shared memories, and younger generations began reclaiming narratives that had often been written by outsiders. The story of the Southwest was being retold, not as the inevitable disappearance of Native peoples, but as a history of survival and adaptation. The Comanche had lost the Comanchería. The Apache had lost enormous portions of their traditional territories. The buffalo were gone. The old warrior societies had changed, but the people remained, and their cultures continued evolving. The 20th century therefore became a period of rebuilding, not rebuilding the world exactly as it had been, but building something new from what had survived. A new generation was learning that tradition and modernity did not have to be enemies. A young Comanche person could learn computer skills and traditional history. An Apache student could attend university and still speak their language at home. A tribal government could use modern law to defend ancient connections to land. And an artist could combine traditional designs with contemporary forms. The old world had changed, but the story had not ended. It had simply moved into a new landscape. And as the century continued, the Comanche and Apache would increasingly turn toward cultural revitalization, political sovereignty, and the preservation of language. The battles of the 19th century had faded into history. The new struggle was quieter, but in some ways it was just as important. It was a struggle over memory, over identity, and over the right of future generations to decide for themselves who they would become. The 20th century was changing the Comanche and Apache in ways that no earlier generation could have imagined. The old trails were still remembered. The mountains were still there. The plains still stretched toward the horizon. But the world surrounding them had become modern. Cars moved along roads where horses had once traveled. Electricity reached communities. Telephones connected distant places. And young people were increasingly leaving their reservations to attend schools and find work. For some families, this created a difficult question. How could they enter the modern world without losing the traditions that had carried their people through centuries of change? The answer would not be simple. But gradually, a new movement began to take shape. Cultural preservation became a form of resistance. For the Comanche, language became especially important. The Comanche language had once been heard throughout the southern plains. It had been spoken around camps, during hunts, in family conversations, at ceremonies, and during negotiations. But decades of boarding schools and assimilation policies had weakened its use. English was becoming the dominant language. Older speakers worried that younger generations might not learn Comanche. The same concern existed among Apache communities. Apache languages were diverse, and different communities had their own linguistic traditions. But all faced the same pressure. English-dominated schools, English-dominated government, English-dominated popular culture, and younger people were increasingly surrounded by it. Language loss can happen quietly. A grandparent may speak a native language fluently. Their child may understand it, but speak mostly English. Then the grandchild may understand only a few words. Within a few generations, a language that had existed for centuries can become endangered. Comanche and Apache communities began recognizing this danger. Elders became increasingly important as teachers. Language programs were created, cultural organizations recorded traditional speech. Some schools began introducing native language instruction, and families encouraged children to learn the words of their ancestors. The effort was difficult, but it represented something important. The goal was no longer simply to survive outside pressure. It was to actively restore what had been weakened. The same was happening with traditional stories. For generations, history had been passed through storytelling. Stories could teach children about family, about responsibility, about courage, about the natural world, about mistakes, and about the experiences of ancestors. Written history could preserve dates and events, but oral history could preserve meaning. An elder might remember a story that had been told by their own grandparents. That story could contain details that would never appear in an official government record. It could explain how a family moved, why a place mattered, how a community survived, or what happened during a difficult period. Preserving these stories became increasingly important. The 20th century also saw greater interest in Native history from scholars and museums. But Comanche and Apache people increasingly insisted that their own voices should be central. They wanted their histories told by the people who inherited them. This was a major change. For generations, much of the written history of the Southwest had been produced by outsiders. Spanish officials wrote reports. Mexican officials wrote military accounts. American soldiers wrote memoirs. Settlers wrote newspapers. Travelers described indigenous communities through their own perspectives. These sources are valuable, but they are incomplete. They often focused on conflict. They might describe a raid, a battle, a treaty, a military campaign, but they rarely captured the ordinary life of indigenous families. The child learning to ride, the grandmother preparing food, the hunter tracking an animal, the artist creating a design, the family gathering around a fire, those ordinary moments were also history. And modern Comanche and Apache historians, writers, and cultural leaders increasingly work to preserve them. At the same time, Native art became a powerful way of expressing identity. Comanche artists created paintings, beadwork, clothing, and other works inspired by traditional forms. Apache artists did the same. Some works preserved older designs, others experimented with contemporary styles. The result was not a return to the past. It was something new. Traditional culture was becoming part of modern artistic expression. A young artist could live in a modern city and still create work inspired by ancestral stories. A musician could combine contemporary sounds with native language. A filmmaker could tell a historical story from an indigenous perspective. Culture was becoming something actively created rather than simply inherited. This mattered because the old stereotype of the vanishing Indian had been deeply damaging. For much of American popular culture, indigenous peoples were portrayed as people who belonged to the past. The warrior on horseback, the camp beside the fire, the frontier battle, the closing of the West. But real indigenous communities did not disappear when the frontier changed. They continued living, they raised children, they created governments, they worked, they went to school, they served in the military, they built businesses, they practiced traditions, and they adapted. The Comanche and Apache were modern peoples. Their history did not stop when the reservation era began. In fact, the reservation era created new forms of political organization. Tribal governments became increasingly important. Leaders worked to improve education. They negotiated with federal agencies. They sought economic development. They defended land rights. They worked to improve health care. And they represented their communities in state and national politics. Sovereignty became one of the most important ideas. The question was not simply whether Native people could participate in American society. They already did. The question was whether they could participate while retaining political and cultural identity. The answer increasingly was yes. Tribal governments demonstrated that Native nations could operate modern institutions. They could create courts, manage programs, develop businesses, administer schools, and negotiate agreements. They could use modern legal systems to defend rights that had existed long before the United States. This was a new kind of frontier. There were no cavalry charges, no buffalo hunts, no war parties crossing the plains. Instead, the struggle took place in meeting rooms, government offices, classrooms, courthouses, and community centers. A treaty document could matter as much as a rifle once had. A lawyer could defend land, a teacher could preserve language, an elder could preserve memory, a young person could carry a tradition into a completely new profession. Resistance had changed form, but it had not disappeared. For the Comanche, this process was especially significant because the old Comanchería was gone. There was no possibility of simply returning to the 18th century world. The buffalo herds could not be restored to their former abundance. The railroads could not be removed. The cities could not be erased. The United States had become the dominant political power, so the future had to be built within this new reality. Apache communities faced the same challenge. The mountains and deserts remained part of their cultural landscapes, but the political world had changed permanently. The answer was not to pretend that history had never happened. It was to carry the surviving pieces forward: language, family, ceremony, art, memory, and sovereignty. By the middle and later decades of the 20th century, younger Comanche and Apache people were increasingly exploring their heritage with new confidence. Some asked grandparents questions, some studied old photographs, some recorded stories, some learned traditional arts. Others entered universities and became historians themselves. They were discovering that their history was far larger than the stories they had encountered in school textbooks. It included war, certainly, but it also included diplomacy, trade, agriculture, family life, religion, art, adaptation, and survival. The story of the Comanche and Apache was not simply a story of two peoples fighting over the Southwest. It was the story of two peoples navigating a continent undergoing enormous transformation. They survived the arrival of Europeans. They survived colonial governments. They survived the expansion of Mexico. They survived American military campaigns. They survived the destruction of their traditional economies. And now, they were learning to survive modernity itself. The challenge remained. Could the next generation inherit enough of the old knowledge to carry it forward? Could a language survive when fewer children spoke it? Could tradition survive in a world of television, highways, cities, and technology? Could sovereignty survive within the legal framework of the United States? The answers were still being written, but there was reason for hope, because the people were still here, and as long as there were people willing to remember, the story could continue. The story of the Comanche and Apache had entered a quieter chapter. The battles of the 19th century had faded into memory. The buffalo herds were gone. The great Comanchería no longer existed. Apache resistance had been forced into the reservation system, and the American frontier had become something entirely different. But the end of warfare did not mean the end of struggle. For the Comanche and Apache, the 20th century brought a different kind of challenge. It was a struggle to protect identity, to preserve language, to defend land, and to make sure that younger generations would still know where they came from. For many years, federal policy had assumed that native cultures would eventually disappear. Government officials believed that indigenous people should abandon their traditional ways and become part of mainstream American society. But something unexpected happened. The cultures survived. not always unchanged, not always without loss, but they survived. A Comanche child could grow up speaking English at school while hearing Comanche from an elder at home. An Apache family could live in a modern house while maintaining traditions passed down through generations. A young person could attend an American university and return home with a renewed interest in their heritage. The modern world did not completely erase the old one. Instead, the two worlds began to overlap. This became especially important in education. For generations, schools had often been places where indigenous languages and traditions were discouraged. But Native communities gradually began demanding greater control over what their children learned. Education could no longer be only about assimilation. It could also be about empowerment. Young people needed mathematics, science, history, technology, and professional skills. But they also needed to know their own history. They needed to understand the struggles their grandparents had experienced. They needed to know the meaning of their tribal identity. And they needed access to the languages and traditions that connected them to earlier generations. This change was part of a larger movement towards self-determination. Across the United States, Native nations increasingly demanded greater control over their own affairs. The Comanche and Apache were part of this movement. Tribal governments became more active. Community organizations expanded. Leaders worked with federal officials while also defending tribal authority. The old reservation system had been created largely through federal policy. Now, Native nations were increasingly insisting that they should have a greater role in governing themselves. This was sovereignty in practice. It did not mean isolation. It did not mean rejecting the United States. It meant having the authority to make decisions affecting their own communities. That included education, land, economic development, cultural preservation, and natural resources. The question of land remained particularly important. For the Comanche, enormous portions of their historic territory had been lost. The old hunting grounds were covered by towns, roads, ranches, and farms. For Apache communities, traditional lands had also been divided among reservations, public lands, private property, and growing cities. Yet landscapes still carried meaning. A mountain was not simply a geological formation. A river was not simply a source of water. A valley could be connected to an old story. A trail could be associated with ancestors. The physical landscape could hold memory. This made environmental issues deeply connected to culture. As the 20th century progressed, Native communities increasingly became involved in protecting important landscapes. They raised concerns about mining, water, pollution, development, and the destruction of sacred places. The struggle was no longer fought primarily with weapons. It was fought through petitions, political organizing, legal arguments, public campaigns, and education. The meaning of resistance had changed, but the goal remained familiar: protect the community, protect the homeland, protect the future. Economic development was another difficult question. Reservations often faced serious poverty. Employment opportunities could be limited. Young people sometimes had to leave home to find work. Tribal leaders therefore looked for ways to create stronger local economies. Ranching remained important in some communities. Tourism became increasingly significant. Art and crafts provided income. Businesses were established. Gaming eventually became an important economic activity for some Native nations, and government programs provided additional employment. But development always raised questions. What kind of development? Who benefits? What happens to the land? What happens to water? And what happens to cultural resources? The Comanche and Apache were increasingly determined that economic development should not simply mean repeating the mistakes of the past. The uranium and mining legacies experienced by many Native communities across the Southwest had demonstrated that economic benefits could come with serious long-term consequences. The modern era, therefore, required careful choices. The same was true of tourism. Visitors were fascinated by the history of the American West. They wanted to see landscapes associated with Comanche and Apache history. They wanted to hear stories of warriors and frontier battles. But Native communities had their own perspectives. Their history was not a collection of romantic legends for outsiders. It was the history of living nations, families, communities, and ancestors. Increasingly, Comanche and Apache people were telling those stories themselves. Museums began incorporating Native perspectives. Cultural centers preserved artifacts and oral histories. Tribal historians documented family stories. Artists created new representations of the past. And filmmakers began presenting indigenous perspectives to wider audiences. This changed the way people understood the Southwest. The old image of the frontier was beginning to disappear. Instead of seeing the West simply as a place where American settlers conquered an empty wilderness, people were increasingly learning that the region was already occupied by complex indigenous societies. The Comanche were not simply warriors, they were traders, hunters, farmers in some contexts, parents, artists, diplomats, and political leaders. The Apache were not simply enemies of settlers. They were communities with diverse economies, languages, traditions, and political structures. Their histories were much more complicated than the old frontier stories suggested. This growing recognition was important for younger generations. When children see their ancestors represented accurately, history becomes personal. A museum display is no longer just about something that happened long ago. It becomes part of family memory. An old photograph can become a connection. A traditional word can become a doorway into another generation. And a story told by an elder can become a bridge across time. Language preservation became especially important in this process. Both Comanche and Apache languages faced serious challenges. The number of fluent speakers declined. Many younger people grew up speaking primarily English, but communities began working to reverse the trend. Language classes were created. Elders taught younger speakers. Recordings were made. Dictionaries and educational materials were developed. Some schools incorporated native language instruction. The process was difficult. A language cannot be revived simply by printing a textbook. It must be spoken, used, heard, and passed between people. But every new speaker represented a small victory. Every child learning an ancestral word became part of a much larger story. The same was true of traditional arts: beadwork, basketry, weaving, leatherwork, silverwork, painting, and other forms of artistic expression continued. Some traditions changed, some almost disappeared and later experienced renewed interest. Others remained strong within families. Modern artists also began combining traditional ideas with contemporary forms. This created something important. Tradition was no longer seen only as something belonging to the past. It could belong to the future. A young artist could honor an ancestor while creating something completely new. A musician could use a modern recording studio while singing in a native language. A student could study computer science while learning traditional stories from an elder. The worlds were not mutually exclusive. They could exist together. And perhaps that was the greatest achievement of the modern era. The Comanche and Apache had entered the 20th century after losing much of their political independence. They had experienced land loss, cultural pressure, and economic hardship. Yet by the end of the century, they had developed new forms of political and cultural strength. They had not recreated the world of the horse and buffalo. They did not need to. They were creating something else, a modern identity rooted in an ancient past, a future that could still remember the mountains, the rivers, the grasslands, the stories, and the people who came before. The struggle for the Southwest had changed once again. The question was no longer simply who controlled the plains. It was whether the descendants of those who had fought for the region could control their own future. And the answer was beginning to emerge through education, through sovereignty, through language, through memory, and through the determination of a new generation to carry the story forward. The history of the Comanche and Apache had entered a new century, but the questions that had shaped their past were still present. Who controls the land? Who decides how communities should live? What happens when an outside government makes decisions for another people? And perhaps most importantly, how does a culture survive when the world around it is constantly changing? By the later decades of the 20th century, Comanche and Apache communities were increasingly answering these questions for themselves. The old reservation system had been designed to control indigenous peoples, but over time, tribal governments became stronger. Leaders became more experienced. Young people received higher education, and native nations increasingly demanded recognition of their right to govern their own affairs. This movement towards self-determination changed the meaning of sovereignty. For earlier generations, sovereignty had often meant defending territory with warriors and weapons. Now, it could mean defending territory in a courtroom. It could mean negotiating a government contract. It could mean creating a tribal school. It could mean protecting a sacred place, or it could mean teaching a child the language of their ancestors. The battlefield had changed, but the struggle continued. For the Comanche, rebuilding political and cultural identity required remembering a past that had been dramatically disrupted. The Comanchería was gone. The buffalo herds that had once covered the southern plains were gone. The horse-centered economy had changed, and the landscape had been divided by roads, fences, farms, cities, and private property. Yet Comanche identity had survived. Family remained important. Community remained important. Language remained important. And the memories of the old plains were still carried by elders. Those memories became increasingly valuable. An elder who remembered an old Comanche word possessed knowledge that could not easily be replaced. A family story could preserve details absent from official records. A traditional song could connect a young person to ancestors they had never met. A ceremony could create continuity between generations. This was cultural preservation in its most personal form. It happened not in government buildings, but around kitchen tables, at family gatherings, in classrooms, at cultural events, and in conversations between grandparents and grandchildren. The Apache experience was similar. Apache communities had endured the loss of enormous portions of their traditional territories. They had experienced military campaigns, forced relocations, boarding schools, and federal assimilation policies, but they had also maintained strong cultural identities. Different Apache nations continued their own traditions, languages, and political institutions. The history of the Apache could not be reduced to the famous battles involving Cochise or Geronimo. Those figures were important, but the people who lived ordinary lives were equally important. The families who raised children, the farmers, the ranchers, the artists, the teachers, the elders, the people who quietly kept traditions alive. History often remembers warriors because battles are dramatic, but cultures survive because ordinary people continue living. That truth became increasingly visible during the modern era. Comanche and Apache artists began using new forms to express old ideas. Paintings showed landscapes connected to ancestral memory. Jewelry incorporated traditional designs. Beadwork continued. Clothing was created for cultural events. Photography documented families and ceremonies. Film and literature provided new ways to tell indigenous stories. And younger artists increasingly refused to choose between tradition and modernity. They could embrace both. A young person could listen to contemporary music and still learn an ancestral language. They could use social media while participating in cultural events. They could study at a university and return home to learn from an elder. Technology did not automatically destroy culture. It could also become a tool for preserving it. Digital recordings could preserve endangered languages. Online archives could store photographs. Videos could document ceremonies and oral histories when communities chose to share them. Young people could connect with relatives living far away. The modern world created challenges, but it also created possibilities. The same was true of education. For decades, schools had been used to assimilate Native children, but indigenous communities increasingly began taking greater control of education. Some tribal schools incorporated Native languages and cultural knowledge. Students learned standard academic subjects while also learning about their own histories. This was an important transformation. Education no longer had to mean forgetting. It could mean remembering. A student could learn American history while also learning what happened to their own ancestors. They could study the Civil War and also study the indigenous history of the same period. They could learn about westward expansion and understand what that expansion meant to the people already living there. They could learn about the settlement of the plains and understand why the disappearance of the buffalo mattered. History became more complete when more voices were included. This changing approach also influenced museums and public history. For a long time, exhibits about the American West often focused on soldiers, settlers, cowboys, and famous explorers. Native people appeared mainly as characters from the past, but that picture began changing. Museums increasingly worked with tribal communities. Exhibits included indigenous perspectives. Artifacts were presented with greater cultural context, and the descendants of historical communities were invited to help explain their own history. This mattered deeply because the Comanche and Apache were not simply historical subjects. They were living peoples. Their descendants were still here, and they had their own understanding of the past. The story of the Southwest therefore became more complicated and more accurate. The Comanche were not simply enemies of settlers. The Apache were not simply enemies of soldiers. Both peoples had traded with outsiders, negotiated with governments, formed alliances, adapted to new technologies, and made difficult decisions about survival. Their histories contained conflict, but they also contained diplomacy. There was violence, but there was also cooperation. There was displacement, but there was also rebuilding. This complexity is important because it reminds us that history is rarely a simple battle between two sides. The Comanche and Apache themselves were never completely isolated from one another. People were captured and adopted. Individuals sometimes changed communities. Trade connected distant groups. Marriage created relationships. And political circumstances could turn enemies into temporary allies. The Southwest was a network. The people living there were connected in ways that could not be captured by a simple map. As the modern era continued, another issue became increasingly important: the protection of sacred places. Development projects, mining, roads, tourism, and expanding cities sometimes threatened landscapes with cultural significance. For indigenous communities, these were not simply environmental disputes. A sacred mountain could be part of a living tradition. A particular spring could have spiritual importance. A landscape could contain stories passed down through generations. Protecting such places therefore meant protecting culture. This was another form of sovereignty, the right to say, this place matters to us, the right to ask, what happens here, and the right to expect outsiders to listen. These issues connected the present directly to the past. The Comanche and Apache had spent centuries defending access to land. The methods had changed, but the fundamental concern remained. Land was more than property. It was home. It was memory. It was identity. And it was something to be passed to future generations. By the end of the 20th century, both Comanche and Apache communities had traveled an extraordinary distance. They had gone from powerful independent nations of the plains and Southwest to peoples facing military conquest, to communities living under intense federal control, and eventually toward greater self-determination. The journey had been painful. There had been enormous losses. Languages had weakened. Land had been taken. Families had been separated. Traditional economies had been destroyed. But the people had continued, and now a new generation was looking backward and forward at the same time. They were asking what had been lost, what had survived, and what could still be restored. The answer was beginning to appear in language classes, in cultural programs, in tribal governments, in museums, in family stories, in artwork, and in the voices of young people who were discovering that their history was not something to be ashamed of. It was something to carry. The struggle for the Southwest had never truly been only about territory. It had always been about belonging. And now, after centuries of change, the descendants of the Comanche and Apache were reclaiming the right to define what belonging meant for themselves. The story of the Comanche and Apache had traveled a very long distance, from the open grasslands of the southern plains to the mountains and deserts of the Southwest, from the age of the horse and buffalo to the modern world of highways, cities, schools, and technology. The people had changed. The world had changed. But the connection to the homeland remained. By the beginning of the 21st century, the Comanche and Apache were no longer fighting the wars that had defined much of the 19th century. Instead, they were facing a different set of challenges: economic opportunity, education, language preservation, environmental protection, political sovereignty, and the question of how to carry ancient traditions into a modern future. For many young Comanche and Apache people, the past was no longer something they encountered only in textbooks. It was becoming something personal: a family story, a photograph, a place on the landscape, a word spoken by a grandparent, a traditional design, a ceremony, or a memory passed from one generation to another. This renewed interest in heritage was important because so much had been lost. The 19th century had taken lives. The reservation system had disrupted communities. Boarding schools had separated children from their families. Assimilation policies had weakened languages. And land loss had transformed the geography of indigenous life. Yet cultural survival had never depended upon governments. It depended upon people, parents teaching children, grandparents telling stories, elders remembering, and young people choosing to listen. That process continued into the modern era. Language became one of the most important areas of cultural preservation. Comanche is an endangered language, and Apache languages also face serious challenges. The decline did not happen because the languages were somehow incapable of surviving. It happened because generations of government policy made English more powerful in everyday life. English became the language of schools, government, employment, newspapers, television, and eventually the internet. Native languages were pushed into smaller spaces, but communities began pushing back. Language classes appeared, cultural programs expanded, elders taught younger speakers, recorded materials were created, and families began recognizing that every fluent speaker represented a living connection to the past. A language is more than vocabulary. It contains ways of describing the world. It carries humor, family relationships, traditional knowledge, names for places, stories, and concepts that may be difficult to translate perfectly into another language. When a language disappears, part of a people's way of understanding the world can disappear with it. That is why language revitalization became more than an educational project. It became cultural preservation. The same effort appeared in traditional arts. Comanche and Apache artists continued creating beadwork, clothing, jewelry, paintings, baskets, and other works. Some artists followed older techniques closely. Others combined traditional influences with modern styles. Both approaches could be meaningful. Tradition did not require artists to freeze themselves in the past. A young artist could honor an ancestor while creating something completely new. This was especially important because native cultures had often been presented as if they belonged only to history. But culture is alive when people use it. It changes, it grows, it responds to new circumstances. And the Comanche and Apache were doing exactly that. Technology became part of this process. Digital cameras could record elders. Audio recordings could preserve language. Online archives could store photographs and documents. Social media could connect young people with relatives and cultural organizations. Modern technology could therefore become a tool for protecting ancient knowledge. The same technology that connected native communities to the wider world could also help them reconnect with their own past. Political sovereignty remained another major part of the modern story. The Comanche and Apache had spent generations dealing with governments that claimed authority over their lands. Spanish authorities, Mexican authorities, American military authorities, federal agencies. But in the modern era, tribal governments increasingly asserted their own authority. Sovereignty meant having a government that could represent its citizens. It meant creating laws, managing programs, operating courts, developing economic strategies, and negotiating with state and federal governments. This did not erase the complicated relationship with the United States. Federal law continued to affect tribal nations. Congress retained significant authority. Treaties and legal agreements continued to shape relationships. But the existence of modern tribal governments demonstrated something important. The political nations that had existed before American expansion had not simply disappeared. They had changed. They had adapted, and they continued. Economic development became an important part of that adaptation. Reservation communities needed jobs, they needed businesses, they needed infrastructure, and they needed opportunities for young people. Ranching remained important in some areas. Tourism created opportunities. Artists and craftspeople sold their work. Businesses developed. And tribal governments explored different economic strategies. But development also created difficult questions. Would a new project create jobs? Would it damage the environment? Would it affect sacred places? Who would control the revenue? And would future generations benefit? These questions reflected a lesson learned over centuries. Economic survival could not be separated from the health of the homeland. The land had already paid a heavy price. The disappearance of the buffalo had transformed Comanche life. Mining and settlement had altered Apache landscapes. Water resources had become increasingly important, and modern development could create new environmental pressures. Protecting the land, therefore, remained a form of protecting identity. A mountain could be sacred. A river could be part of community history. A valley could contain stories. A trail could connect generations. The landscape itself could serve as a historical record. This perspective challenged the idea that land was simply something to own. For the Comanche and Apache, land could be something to belong to. That difference in perspective had shaped the conflicts of the past, and it continued shaping debates in the present. There was also a growing effort to correct the way Native history was presented to the public. For generations, popular stories about the American West had often reduced the Comanche and Apache to images of warriors and raids. These stories could be dramatic, but they were incomplete. They rarely showed the complexity of indigenous societies. They rarely showed children, families, farmers, traders, artists, diplomats, elders, or political leaders. Modern historians and tribal scholars began expanding the story. They emphasized trade, diplomacy, family, adaptation, spiritual traditions, economic systems, and cultural continuity. The result was a more complete picture. The Comanche were not simply warriors. The Apache were not simply warriors. They were peoples with complex societies who had spent centuries adapting to changing circumstances. Their conflicts with each other were real. Their wars with colonial and American governments were real. But so were their relationships with neighbors. Trade crossed boundaries. People moved between communities. Alliances changed. And history rarely followed a straight line. That complexity is important because it reminds us that the Southwest was never a simple story of two sides. It was a world of many peoples making decisions in response to one another. The Comanche and Apache were major powers within that world. They fought, they negotiated, they adapted, and ultimately, they survived. The great Comanche power of the 18th and 19th centuries was gone. The Apache warrior societies of the old frontier had changed, but survival did not require recreating the past exactly as it had been. It required carrying forward what mattered: language, family, memory, culture, land, and the right to determine the future. The struggle for the Southwest had therefore entered another chapter. The question was no longer whether the Comanche or Apache would control the open frontier. That world was gone. The question was whether their descendants could shape the modern world without losing themselves within it. And as the new century unfolded, the answer was increasingly visible. They were still here, still speaking, still creating, still remembering, still teaching, still governing, and still looking toward the landscapes their ancestors had known, not simply as reminders of the past, but as places where the future would continue to be built. And so, after centuries of movement, conflict, adaptation, and survival, the story brings us back to the land. The southern plains are quieter now. The great buffalo herds no longer cover the horizon. The riders who once crossed hundreds of miles on horseback are part of history. The old Comanchería has disappeared. The Apache wars have ended. The forts and trading posts that once marked the frontier have become towns, highways, ruins, or memories. And yet, the story of the Comanche and Apache did not end when the wars ended. It continued. It continued in families, in languages, in ceremonies, in artwork, in photographs, in tribal governments, and in the voices of elders speaking to children. That may be the most important lesson in this entire history. A people does not disappear simply because its political power has been reduced. A homeland can be divided. A government can impose new laws. An economy can be destroyed. A language can be pushed aside. But identity can survive, and survival is not always dramatic. Sometimes survival is quiet. It is a grandmother teaching a child a word, a father telling a story about an ancestor, a family gathering for a ceremony, an artist creating a traditional design, a student researching the history of their people, a tribal leader defending a community's rights. These moments may never appear in a battlefield history book, but they are history. The Comanche and Apache both experienced enormous losses. Their ancestors faced warfare, displacement, disease, land loss, and political pressure. Their traditional economies were transformed. Their children were subjected to assimilation policies. Their languages were weakened, and their lands were reduced. But they also adapted to every new world that appeared before them. They adapted to the horse. They adapted to Spanish power. They adapted to Mexico. They adapted to the United States. They adapted to the reservation system. And eventually they adapted to the modern world. Adaptation did not mean forgetting. It meant finding ways to carry important things forward. The Comanche could enter modern society without becoming less Comanche. Apache communities could participate in the American economy without surrendering their identity. Young people could attend universities and still learn from elders. Modern technology could be used to preserve ancient languages. Tribal governments could use modern legal systems to defend connections to lands that had mattered for generations. This is why the final chapter of this story should not be about disappearance. It should be about continuity. The Comanche and Apache are living peoples. Their nations continue, their communities continue, their cultures continue, and their histories are still being written. When we look at the old photographs of Comanche riders or Apache leaders, it can be tempting to think of them as belonging to a distant world. But the people in those photographs had children. Those children had children. And those generations eventually became the people living today. History is therefore not separated from the present. It is standing in the present. The young Comanche person learning an ancestral language is connected to the riders of the old plains. The Apache student studying history is connected to the people who traveled through the mountains generations ago. The artist creating a modern work inspired by traditional designs is connected to ancestors whose names may never have been written down. The connection is not always visible, but it is there. And perhaps this helps us understand the old conflict between the Comanche and Apache differently. It was never simply a story about two groups fighting for territory. It was part of a much larger history of people adapting to a changing continent. The Comanche expanded. The Apache resisted. They fought one another. They traded with one another. They sometimes captured people. They sometimes formed relationships. They responded to Spanish power. They responded to Mexican power. They responded to American expansion. And eventually, both were forced to confront the same enormous transformation. The United States had changed the political and economic structure of the Southwest, but it could not erase the peoples who had lived there. The old struggle for territory eventually became a struggle over memory and identity. Who would tell the story? Whose history would be remembered? Whose version would appear in textbooks? For a long time, outsiders told much of the story. Soldiers described campaigns. Settlers described raids. Government officials described treaties. Travelers described what they saw. These records remain valuable, but they cannot tell everything, because history also lives in oral traditions, in family memories, in native languages, in places, in ceremonies, and in the knowledge passed from one generation to another. Today, Comanche and Apache communities continue working to preserve that knowledge. They support cultural education. They protect traditions. They document languages. They preserve historical materials. They teach younger generations. And they continue developing their own futures. Their future will not look like the 18th century, nor should it. The world has changed too much, but the future does not have to abandon the past. A culture can change and remain itself. A language can evolve. Art can develop. Political institutions can modernize. Technology can become part of everyday life. And still, the connection to ancestors can remain. That is perhaps the strongest thread running through the entire history we have traveled tonight. From the first Comanche migrations toward the plains, to the rise of the horse culture, to the expansion of the Comanchería, to the long struggle with Apache communities, to Spanish and Mexican rule, to American expansion, to the destruction of the buffalo, to the reservation era, and finally to the modern age, the people continued adapting. The landscape changed. The political powers changed. The economy changed. The technology changed. But the people endured. So, when you imagine the Southwest tonight, do not imagine it only as the frontier of old Western movies. Imagine something much older. Imagine grass moving beneath a wide sky. Imagine buffalo crossing the plains. Imagine riders traveling along distant trails. Imagine Apache families moving through mountain country. Imagine Comanche families gathering after a long journey. Imagine traders exchanging goods. Imagine elders telling stories. Imagine children listening. And then let the scene slowly move forward through time. Let the buffalo disappear into the distance. Let the railroads cross the plains. Let towns rise. Let highways appear. Let modern cities grow. And finally, let the camera return to the people, because that is where the story has always belonged. Not simply in battles, not simply in treaties, not simply in the actions of governments, but in the people who lived through those changes, the people who raised families, the people who remembered, the people who adapted, the people who refused to disappear. The Comanche and Apache story is therefore not a story with a clean ending. It is still unfolding. New generations are asking new questions. They are deciding what traditions to preserve, what languages to revive, what stories to tell, what places to protect, and what kind of future they want. The struggle for the Southwest may have begun with horses, buffalo, territory, and survival, but in the modern world, the struggle is also about memory, about sovereignty, about culture, about belonging, and about the right of a people to tell its own story. So tonight, as our journey comes to an end, remember the vast landscapes that shaped these histories. Remember the Comanche riders of the plains. Remember the Apache communities of the mountains and deserts. Remember the families who endured displacement. Remember the children who carried languages forward. Remember the elders who preserved stories. And remember that history does not always end when the battle ends. Sometimes, that is when the most important chapter begins. The Comanche and Apache are still here, still remembering, still adapting, still creating, still teaching, and still looking toward the future. The plains may be quieter now. The buffalo may be gone from the horizon. The old frontier may exist only in photographs and stories, but beneath the modern roads and cities, the land still remembers. And so do the people. The struggle for the Southwest has ended as a military conflict, but the story of the people who lived through it continues, quietly, patiently, across generations, under the same enormous sky.